Legacy Russell is a curator and writer. Born and raised in New York City, she is Associate Curator of Exhibitions at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Her academic, curatorial, and creative work focuses on gender, performance, digital selfdom, internet idolatry, and new media ritual. She is the recipient of the Thoma Foundation 2019 Arts Writing Award in Digital Art, the 2020 Rauschenberg Residency Fellow, and a recipient of the 2021 Creative Capital Award. Her first book, Glitch Feminism, a Manifesto, is published by Verso Books in 2020. Her second book, Black Meme, is forthcoming via Verso Books.
Hello, everyone who's online and with whom we have just watched this very amazing video called Glitch Feminism, and with a hashtag before. And we're now with Legacy Russell, who kindly has joined us for some conversation after having seen this piece, which I would even call a collage. Could you, Legacy, tell us a little bit more about this essay, this video essay that I believe you've shown in different occasions with different links, and maybe it has changed over time or maybe not, and wondering how this video emerges before or exists in relation to the book that came out last November 10th, 2020. So can you tell us about the context within which it was first shown, how it has changed and how it has been updated? And I noticed that there's a computer voice in the version that we just watched that wasn't always present.
Yes, I'm happy to speak to it. First of all, it's great to be here. Thank you all so much for being so generous and having me. And yeah, thinking about Glitch Feminism, the video essay, which is what I call it. Typically when I work on projects as I am writing, I create kind of visual reference points that then allow for me to have these things exist kind of as performative lectures or kind of instructive materials that can be a bit of a key, if you will, to the various parts of my research and thinking around the projects that I am expanding on. So within this context, I created this video essay in 2018. It was something that was responsive to a moment where I was very much so recognizing that aspects of this that I had created kind of for my own viewership would be useful for other people to see. The automated voice that comes as a part of that is something that is meant to stand in proxy or kind of in avatar to me, an extension of myself that of course, engages all the same histories of kind of cyberfeminism and cybernetics and sort of cyborg theory, all of these things, kind of pushing at those various limits and experimenting within them. The actual points across this video essay are slightly different than the ones that are existing within the actual book of Glitch Feminism. And the reason for that is, of course, because this is a material that, like I said, right, is a research material. It's meant to live as a kind of organic and changeable thing. It's something that expands and contracts over time, and really is also something that marks early parts of this thinking, as, you know, of course, it now has changed and transformed over these many years.
Thank you so much. So I presume you'll continue to work on it like an eternal open artwork that reacts to.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it will continue to kind of expand and change in pieces. I'm moving on now to my second book, Black Meme. And so actually there is a video essay for that is available and, you can view online. So, these are things obviously that take on different lives, I suppose, as, I move forward with other projects. So I will not necessarily be working on this Glitch Feminism essay indefinitely, but rather, it may change in perspective as I change, right? So, not closing off the possibility of having it be something that I come back to in the future.
Wonderful. So I'd like to know something more about your optimistic outlook, which you propose and the view proposes the glitch as a positive departure from contemporary technocracy and extractivism. This is, in a way, somehow different from the premises of digital PTSD. And paradoxically, it was important to invite you precisely because of this optimistic outlook. So what potential do you see in this broadening of the realm of the unrecognizable through digitization?
Yeah, so I will say that while Glitch Feminism is absolutely, I agree with you, an optimistic text because it looks at the generative possibilities of what being digitally networked, digitally mediated, digitally distributed, right, can look like. It also is a text that is very much aware of all parts of internet culture and cyber culture. So of course, you know, it speaks to and through some of those challenges and to, as you said, the paradoxes within it. The reason why I feel as if it is important to note the kind of distinction, what Glitch Feminism aims to do as a text and as a manifesto is that it really looks at the way the glitch can move through the practices of various artists themselves, right? So it's not necessarily to say that things on the internet are necessarily any different than as we see and reflected within physical space. Rather, actually, it speaks to the loop between on and offline as being something that's incredibly important. You know, recognizing that obviously all the things that we are, you know, challenged by, that are troubling about the internet and digital space, you know, really are reflections of the world itself, right? So, you know, these are things that actually cannot live in isolation from one another. So, you know, be that as it is, with my, you know, ongoing investment and passion for art history, you know, really it's an opportunity to look at what it means to glitch, right? What does that look like? How can that operate as a vehicle through the practices of incredible artists like Tabitha Razar, an artist, Boy Child, Kila Beja. These are just a few of the incredible folks who are, you know, within these pages who are thinking about what does it mean? Yes, existing within this moment in time where the world is extractive and our presence on the internet absolutely has extractive possibilities, but how can we intervene within that and you know, position ourselves as being glitches within a kind of techno culture that can be radical and imaginative and open up new possibilities.
Very interesting. Now, we're connected to you from Torino in Italy, to you in New York. And in Torino, we're in the Castello di Rivoli, which is a museum, a physical 18th century building, actually 3 buildings with different collections and exhibitions inside of them. And we've been closed for quite a long time. One of the reasons for digital PTSD is to do research. Basically, is to do research together with the public who is watching us, but it's for us at the museum to think through certain issues and problems. And one of the basic issues that we think about a lot now is the access to the physical space of the museum in this period. We have been through many long lockdowns since February 2020. And at the same time, these lockdowns, due to the pandemic, to decrease the pandemic, go hand in hand with an increase in digitization of cultural activities, which is also required and asked of us by our governments. What I'm wondering is how you think or you see the museum, or I don't know if there's an answer in general, and if it's just more case by case, but how you see museums and how they should move forward in a time where we are at the same time establishing that the encounter with art can be, and some people think should be, mainly digital, or if not exclusively digital, given the closure of the museum. So how do you see this crossroads of the museum? At the same time, we're at a moment where museums, especially in the Anglo-American world, there's been a lot of debate around museums as being colonial constructions across the board. Do you see that everywhere in the world? And if so, how do you think that the museums should transform, and into what?
I guess the first thing I'll say is that the position of museums being colonial sites is not an American position. I don't know if I agree with that as a premise. I will say that as we look at international discourse around museums as sites, right, the ongoing conversations around repatriation, and as well what it means for museums to exist within the possibility of intersections with communities and new communities, right, that are best reflective of our current moment in the world, feels like something that indicates that all museums across the world are trying to grapple with the reality of a colonial history, an imperial history that is built into the very bedrock of what museums are all about. So, I will say that, as an American speaking from, the United States at present, that it feels really necessary to not have this be something that is made exclusive to our position, but rather to recognize that actually it is dispersed, it lives everywhere. And when we think about the future of museums, it is an opportunity to think through what new models can look like. I also will say that, I'm speaking as a curator at the City Museum in Harlem, which is a very special institution for those who, have spent time there, and as well for those who may be new to our mission, given that we are with our kind of goal in terms of our program and the projects that we produce to hold center artists of African descent. So recognizing that, the ongoing discussions of what it means to decolonize art institutional spaces, with museums being as a core spoke to that, I do feel that the Studio Museum's mission is deeply instructive to how that can operate. It really comes down to thinking about not only the museum's position in the world and recognizing that, this ongoing discussion can be, a sort of conduit to think through questions of audience and public and participation and power, but also to kind of think of its histories, right? And what it means to kind of delve into some of these sticky histories that at points can be quite uncomfortable about, museums and why they, exist, how they were founded, who they were intended to serve in the first place, and recognize that actually some of those things as part of the early goals of these different places and spaces may not be reflective of what we need in the here and now. So when you ask about this idea of future, it feels very important to think through where those disconnects maybe have been made more visible, and at points too to have museums be very ready and prepared to think through actively how they can integrate some of that conversation into how they program, how they produce, how they are, existing within the arc of education, how they are intersecting with artists and, engaging not only their boards in that process, but also their process of acquisitions for collecting institutions. All of these things become kind of really exciting parts of what that futurity can look like, and a way too to invest in a more sustainable model for artists as we move into the future. So that's my great hope. And, of course, too, thinking of this question of decolonization, that it is a global mission. It's an opportunity for people to be thinking through the ways where underrepresented folks who are producing incredible work can be brought into center space, right? And center space in conversation maybe at points with some of these complicated histories to better inform them and to help us recognize maybe what has been rendered visible versus not over time, and ask ourselves why.
So, but I just to understand, you don't mean that the Studio Museum is a colonial structure too? You mean that?
I think museums across the board, right, always have work to do, because the structure of the museum, right, is a complicated structure. And I will say that the Studio Museum in Harlem is an incredible space because it was founded in 1968. It's a space that comes out of a discussion about how to do museum work better, right, and how to do it differently. And so for that reason, I think that, it sets a very high bar. It's a really exciting space because of the fact that it allows artists to be in that driver's seat to help us think through how to build a future and have artists be a guide to that.
So you see it more as a model. You see it as a model.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that the work that museums across the board continue to do, and I think it's been really exciting to see these things become possible in lots of places and spaces, including Costello, is that actually allowing artists to shape a museum's mission is something that is part of the strategic, sustainable work of what a future museum should look like. and as well is radical in the fact that it proposes that the creative presence of artists within institutional spaces expands them, and that in and of itself is a really amazing opportunity to think through how to bring in new perspectives into an institutional space and allow artists really to be innovating through museums and of course beyond them. So with that, I feel like there are many different possibilities across all of the incredible institutions whom we collaborate with, and as well those across the world who of course are part of this conversation in this program. But I really do feel like it's an opportunity for us all to be considering this idea of what it is to have a mission that centers artists and allow for many different institutions to take that on as an opportunity, as a challenge, as a conversation, right? And that actually can be something that allows for a more expansive idea of what this space can be.
Yes, I certainly agree. And in fact, Castello di Rivoli was born from artists.
Exactly.
The whole Arte Povera movement, and in a way they are our main stakeholders because museums are not everywhere run in the same way. So we don't have as much private funding and boards of collectors as there are in most museums where there's a more private base for the funding, which for us is more public funding and than private. But the other half of the question was about the physical embodied experience, which as an old woman of 63 years old at this point, and not a digital native, I wonder, is it just because I'm an older person and it would be fine that the museum just closes and turns into a big storage, a big storage for objects from the past, and we, slash the budget to 10% of what it is now? Or is it meaningful to have people, to not over digitalize, as some governments are encouraging in Europe? The recovery plan of the European Union is all about digitalization, and rather, consider this embodied experience or the space. I call it the space of stasis, the space where things slow down compared to the acceleration of the rest of our life. Is this kind of obsolete space of slowing down a little bit, like in La Jetée, of Marker, meaningful to young people who are working in the 21st century? Or is it something that, you don't find in need of existing, or of existing too much?
I think that we're dealing with some dangerous logic here. And so I want us to take a moment to maybe suss out some of the various strands. The first is the assumption that museums should be rendered obsolete and be replaced with digital versions of museums. I think that is a proposal, obviously is not something that is viable for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons is because, of course, these architectures are going to exist regardless, right? So that it becomes a question of how do we occupy them or reoccupy them towards strategic means, towards new imaginations, towards new possibilities of engaging with different programs and audiences. But I will also say that there needs to be less of a conflation between what we are seeing as a trend of government, right? The state's support of digital, right? Which, as we know, turning to at points questions of the state in intersection with the creative has a long and complicated history, and of course, specific depending on where you go, right? It's very local in terms of its approach, questions of conservatism versus liberalism there and how those things are defined. I will say that, a version of this that is cynical is that the state itself obviously would invest in the digital because there is an assumption that, they can use that to basically undercut and underfund the arts, right? That is something that, is not surprising, but also is not absolute. The other thing is that, the assumption that digital should not exist or be deprioritized also is rife with problems of access. Part of the reason why I think the internet, of course, it remains so important to the future of museums is largely because of the fact that oftentimes people walk in the door, right? Their first experience in entering into institutional sites is happening online more and more. So, for folks who are, living in the US, they may experience the Louvre via the Louvre's Instagram before they have the opportunity to actually physically visit there. That is actually remarkable, and more that is the norm, right? But that does not mean that it is a replacement of the physical experience of the institution. And so I will say that when we talk about questions of access, right, and really to a privilege, that it becomes an opportunity to think through what are the ways in which digital space allows for new audiences and new publics to access institutions that historically have been closed to them. That for me feels like the most urgent question. And at points too, to recognize that even there is within that, kind of embedded within that, are so many questions of this idea of the digital divide, right? As in the kind of class questions, often tied to who does and does not have access to the internet. Point blank, right? These are geopolitical questions. These are class-based questions that deeply kind of trigger us in terms of questioning our privilege institutionally. So I think it's maybe not so simple, and I would be very wary to simplify it, right? To say that actually the younger generation is keen to eliminate institutions and replace it with the digital, and then conflate that with these ideas that, of course, the state is in support of a similar vision. Quite the contrary, I would say. Many folks who are kind of a younger generation, who are, as you say, digital natives, are quite keen to think through the bridge between new audiences, new definitions of what institutions are, right? And that includes kind of expanding the role and the model of care, creative care, that can be possible within museums as sites and as political sites, which really they need to be. And then thinking through one step beyond that, right? Not the idea of the digital as a replacement, because I think that that is very much so kind of part of the fear mongering of this moment, people feeling very anxious that they will not be able to get back into physical space. And so the idea that they, will have the kind of online be a replacement to their in-person experience, but rather actually as an extension to it, and as one that's really necessary, because as we know, when we think of access, there are so many people who are not able to access every single institution in the world. That comes with a certain level of privilege when we make that assumption. And so it becomes really necessary when we have these conversations to not have them operate within a vacuum.
Yeah, or not. I mean, it's not necessary for everyone. Very few people actually access, only very privileged people access physically all the museums of the world who are able to travel. But one can also think of a very grounded local institution in the local community as well. So without necessarily the need for it to be projected across the planet. I mean, because also of the misunderstandings that occur, to misunderstand, for example, arte povera, taking it out of context, or certain other things, sometimes it might be okay. We are not, how do you say, humans, but any species on the planet. We are not omnipotent, and some form of locality might also be stressed, how do you say, encouraged.
But I will say, Carolyn, to your point about arte povera, right? The scholarship of arte povera has been produced all over the world. So actually, kind of working with that understanding that some of these things need to exist purely at the local, right? Just serves the possibility for an international discourse. And I do feel like actually this is why it's exciting to think about if the digital can be a great bridge to amplifying, right? Opportunities for sort of conversation, intersection, et cetera, collaboration internationally, that yes, 100% certain things are intended to exist at the local level, but that they still can drive a global conversation about parts of art history that really do have a cultural and kind of social role, a significance that extends beyond the site that they were originally produced. So yes, for me, that feels really necessary.
That's true. That's true for sure. So we're speaking about this rise of the digital technologies, and it makes me think back to other very, how do you say, watershed moments, like the invention of the printing press and its impact on distribution and access to knowledges. And there are some similarities. One of the things that happened with the rise of the printing press and books is a collapse of oral cultures, you know, the ability to memorize books and poems and to change them slowly along song lines in different forms of song lines. So because I know that in history, different technologies that are prosthetic then generally atrophies certain other aspects. For example, in the case of the printing press that we just mentioned, what would be the parts that today are somehow maybe at a risk? I mean, it seems to me, but I might be wrong, that has to do with written texts, because there's so much written work on the internet, so many words, and so little time to actually either print them or read them after a very quick appearance and disappearance, like in a WhatsApp. I'm wondering if we are also now doing a kind of reverse procedure compared to when the printing press was developed. In other words, moving towards a more oral culture, oral and visual combined performative storytelling culture, away from the traditionally written cultures of the book, meaning those descending from the monotheistic religions that then shaped European culture as a culture based on the written word. I mean, how you feel about that with the internet?
I would say, you know, there are, again, maybe some assumptions here that I would maybe want to examine further. One assumption would be that, you know, our understanding of language, right? That actually the written word is the sole form of a kind of democratized expression, right? That actually, and prioritizing the things that are written over things that actually are performed, right? Which I recognize you kind of had brought up in some of your questioning. TikTok and Vine as being something that was an example of a kind of performative space. But I would say that the cultures of the internet, right, as these exist through a kind of cyber culture that are deeply performative, that do exist within traditions of oral history, are also ones that are reflective of a ongoing tradition of oral and narrative history that is somatic, that has been expressed and articulated through Black and queer histories, through female identified history, through histories of marginalized people and oppressed people around the world, that actually recognizing this question or challenge of language and interrogating what that even means. What should that look like? Whose language are we speaking and toward what end? And ways to do decolonized work through that process feels really necessary. I also will say that, like, you know, we can't necessarily make the assumption that knowledge is being lost largely because—
I can see that. Sorry to interrupt you, but you're there. I would like to question the assumption that you have, the assumption that I should have. I had no assumption that there was a loss in that is negatively connotated. I was just observing. I mean, when the printing press happens, there's a decrease in oral culture, oral storytelling. For example, the bard, you know, in the south of France and so on. I'm not saying that it would have been better that there were not. So now I'm not making any judgment on of merit or demerit. I'm just asking if you believe that we might be moving towards a more oral, performative, somatic forms of culture with a decrease of attention towards, let's call it the written text of the last 5 centuries after the printing press. Which is a very short amount of time anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, like, the printing press is a very specific example, drives obviously the production and circulation of biblical texts specifically within an Anglo tradition, right? But that actually running that alongside of the ongoing conversations tied to oral histories, right? They're actually, when you say that there was a decrease in the sort of transmission of oral histories, the question is within what culture? I would challenge the assumption that, of course, that was something that was happening across the entire world, largely because, of course, oral traditions have remained very, very integral actually to Black history specifically. So with that in mind, I will say that, you know, thinking of this question of performative, I don't think it's an either or. I don't think that actually, you know, it's necessarily resulting in a decrease of the written in being replaced by or in prioritization of the performative. I think that as they always have, they will live side by side. I think as well that they, you know, will continue to be of support to each other and as well critique one another. And I do feel very strongly that there is an opportunity here for folks, you know, as they're thinking through what it means to have a presence on the internet, that actually the internet is an incredible archive, you know, especially when we think of it through the lens of a kind of queer and Black gesture culture, right? And when we think about the ways where actually what needs to be protected, maintained, considered, right, compensated for, engaged within the economy of digital space, is asking questions about, you know, what are the models of digital, right, that can be continue to be critiqued, right, as we think of it as an archival site, really. That actually part of what this accelerationist process of producing a lot of knowledge all at once should not be purely just for the sake of production, right, but actually too through the sake of the maintenance of it, right, and then as well having those things exist as document into the future. So that would be, yeah, I guess my hope, and as well, you know, the ways where those two things can remain in conversation with one another.
I understand. That's very interesting. And it probably is indeed so because of the multi and the plurality of connotations of all these spaces. So just to conclude, I'd like to ask you something a little more personal. And it is, I'm always curious about people who end up in the arts, you know, and why and how that happened and why they choose that field. I mean, it's probably because I'm still asking myself that question after 30, 40 years. And so I learn from other people's answers to this question. But I was wondering about your choice to work in this field and where you think you'd like to go with it. You know, what are your goals? And
big question. I will say I began with my interest in working in the arts. My first fellowship was working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, way back when, you know, over a decade ago. And, you know, I've since gone on, I worked at the Whitney, I worked at the Brooklyn Museum, you know, creative time. You know, now being at the Studio Museum, I have a long, incredible relationship with various scales of institutions. And, you know, really what has kept me in this work are the artists. I do feel, you know, really deeply invested in thinking about the future of art through the lens of the future of artists, right? Because I think too that the precarity of the position of the artist as we exist in the here and now is something that requires deep allyship and solidarity and ongoing deep tissue work across institutional spaces. And that really needs to be one of the primary responsibilities of museums at all scales, existing in all parts of the world. So for me, that is the thing that gets me out of bed in the morning. It allows me to think through, not abstractly, but quite concretely, how do we invest in the life of artists? And having those things be deep and durational, not existing as an event, you know, at one particular point in an artist's career, but rather actually at multiple stages, multiple points of kind of view, of blossoming. And my hope is, you know, as a curator, to see artists through those different chapters, to be able to have those investments exist kind of in multitude, right? And with great variance, encouraging artists to experiment and expand and to play. And how do we as curators hold space for that within institutional spaces? That becomes kind of the ongoing life commitment, one that, you know, is not I suppose, one that times out, right? It's something that will exist, in the here and now, and hopefully as well, into the future as I keep doing this work. So, I get very much kind of excited about what that is and how to contribute in that way. And I also feel that, it is often maybe the simplest answer, right? Thinking about, of course, working within museum spaces, of course, we are here for the artist, but I will say that that is not always the case. And so, I do feel that it is a continued commitment, right? It's one that you kind of have to renew each year as you do this work, and thinking through the ways where artists can stay centered to our goals, and as well, of course, be great guides to us as we think through what these next steps should look like in the world.
Yes, I agree with you completely. Completely. And I think we do that, but not just in a way to create the possibility or to serve the opening of these possibilities for artists. I think also because the artists are, in general, are people who, those who decide to associate with being an artist, because that's self-definition in a way, are also people who are very, very, have hard times because the society doesn't legitimize this work often, but also are very free. And there still is this hope that there is agency, and then and that there is the possibility of creating worlds and making worlds. And artists tend to believe that that's true. So thank you very much for your time with us today.
Legacy Russell presented hashtag Glitch Feminism, which was followed by a Q&A with Carolyn Christov-Bakargiev. Hashtag Glitch Feminism is a video essay and performative lecture from 2018, based on Legacy Russell's research toward her recent publication, Glitch Feminism, a Manifesto from 2020, which is a vital new chapter in cyberfeminism. Glitch Feminism explores the relationship between gender, technology, and identity. In this urgent manifesto, Russell reveals the many ways that the glitch performs and transforms, how it refuses, throws shade, encrypts, mobilises, and survives. Russell argues that we need to embrace the glitch in order to break down the binaries and limitations that define gender, race, and sexuality.